To start with some modeling, we think at the core of this debate, it is a question of between individualism and collectivist cultures. We think that there's a dichotomy between the two due to the fact that if you focus on the individual, that inherently trades off with communal understandings of how culture should be implemented, how social interactions should happen. With this in mind, we would contend that also this dichotomy probably exists because humans are fundamentally tribal creatures. So if you force them to act in communal settings, they tend to act in a tribal way where they want to enforce collectivist norms and create uniformity within their culture. With this in mind, our first argument is about how the adverse psychological harms of conformity. First, I want to start with like a case study of Japan. Japan has a saying called deru kugi wa utareru, which means the nail that sticks out gets beaten down. I want to be clear, I'm not saying Japanese culture as a whole is bad, and that would be a like gross straw man of my argument, but I'm saying this particular aspect of Japanese culture is probably very close to the core of the debate about collectivism versus individualism, which again, remember, is a clear dichotomy due to the fact that if you don't prioritize the individual, you probably are doing communal activities instead. The way that the motion is worded, it explicitly talks about how it's instead of communal activities, so it's likely that there's a trade-off between the two. With this in mind, how does the need for conformity result in exclusionary practices? We think there are three adverse harms of pushing for conformity. The first of which is respecting differences. Japan is like a isolated island nation that actually has a lot of xenophobia as a result of this need for conformity, and this includes the need for racial conformity. This is demonstrated by the extremely strict immigration policies that structurally make it very difficult for people to move to Japan, or like even when you try to get a job, it's often very difficult if you are not Japanese in Japan. The second case is valuing, rather than looking down upon a variety of personality. Again, continuing with the case study of Japan, Japan has statistically much higher bullying rates and the highest suicide rates in the developed world. And I would contend that this is largely because of this idea of hitting down that nail that sticks out, saying that differences are not okay. I would contend that a more individualist approach to society would probably decrease the amount of bullying, because oftentimes bullying is structured around discovering differences between one individual from the collective or communal norm and then outcasting that individual. However, the comparative is quite clear. Oh yeah, I'll take a POI. From oh, never mind. Okay, moving on. So as I was saying, bullying generally is about looking at differences of individuality and using that as a means of hurting someone psychologically. The third is valuing your own needs. In Japan also, they have one of the highest rates of karoshi, which means workers literally work themselves to death. This is largely a norm because everyone says, oh, it's normal to work a ton and work an unhealthy amount, which results in a lot of people working so much that they literally die from working too much. So clearly, from these three reasons, we can tell that there are adverse psychological harms of trying to make people act in a similar manner. The comparative is clear. If you prioritize individualism and cherish it, it's okay to be that nail that sticks out, and there isn't this like societal pressure. I would contend that this is also a higher magnitude impact due to the fact that if the entire social fabric or the entire social circle pushes you out, you have no safety net because you have no one to talk to, because people just push you out of the collectivist norm because you are an individual that doesn't actually go into the tribal mindset of being similar and operating under a framework. We think it's pretty fundamental that this tribal mindset is like a fundamental aspect of just like human, like evolutionarily, humans like things that are similar to them because they can predict the other person because they operate under a framework that they understand. I'll take some POI from Sia.
Sure. You indicate that collectivism can cause you to kind of lose your support net or your safety net from other individuals because of the pressure to conform. But how is this safety net ever created in a world where you don't prioritize interacting with other people and building those relationships?
Yeah. So I would contend that you need to start with like cherishing individualism. And then after that, you can actually create a society that actually, like, we're not saying society will just disappear. Like, there is still like a social fabric, but the prioritization is not the communal structures that exist and making people similar, but instead it's more about the individual and how the individual constructs the society rather than the reverse. With that in mind, my second argument, which is also extremely important, is about empowering women. Single households are probably very good for feminist liberation for three reasons. The first is that you don't have patriarchal influences, that the man has to fulfill this gender role of being the bread maker, and the value in actually like finding a man, it goes away if you can actually have a single household without the pressure of being in a marriage. I also want to just point out a side note that marriage is fundamentally like diametrically opposed to independence due to the fact that usually in a marriage you have to have like communal property, and everyone knows that in a marriage there's this conception of being a team. The second is, if the cultural mindset shifts to this as the endpoint, education shifts to helping students achieve this, which dismantles many of the mechanisms that patriarchy uses to generate internalized sexism. So if you actually teach people to be okay with being independent and not having to have this end goal of marriage, they can actually break free from these social norms that create a lot of sexism. But the third is that many women internalize perceptions of romance that leave them to blame if relationships don't work out. They carry the emotional burden of a healthy relationship, which is really bad, because if they feel like they carry the emotional burden, oftentimes this entraps them into abusive relationships. But if they feel that they don't have that emotional burden to have this like communal relationship, this communal ideal, then they can break free from a bad relationship.
Okay, thank you very much. We now invite the leader of the opposition to open up the opposition half of this debate. And by the way, when you hit 7:15, I'll just put my hands up like this to let you know. Hear, hear.
Okay, yeah, if you guys don't mind just throwing the POIs in the chat box, I'll have it open the entire time. I feel like that's better than you guys having to sit here with your hands raised, especially if people are trying to take notes or anything like that. Of course, if that doesn't work for you, try to get my attention any other way. Just please don't like be too disruptive or anything like that. Okay. Let me get my timer started. Okay, so I'm going to be starting in 3, 2, 1. So I'm going to do a couple quick points of extraneous rebuttal. I have a lot of rebuttal interwoven that directly, because our points clash really hard with OG's. And then I'm also want to kind of like set out like these burdens, because I think it was kind of unclear exactly like what either side is trying to support out of like what we got out of the PM. So first, a couple points of just quick rebuttal that we think are kind of ridiculous to come out of the PM speech. The first idea of this like working too much, and that is purely caused by like a collective culture. So first of all, no, we don't think that. We think people are overworked in the United States as well. And we don't think it is, we think it actually is this prioritization of individual success and progress with more individualistic communities that then push people to like pursue individualistic success in like an economic or business sense so much that they prioritize every other aspect of their life. We actually think this point falls on our side of the house because OG has given us zero mechanism about why they just said, okay, there's kind of a communitarian culture, but then people overwork. No, we show you that it's the individualistic pursuit of this economic benefit. This is the problem. We think we actually see more of that problem on the gov side. Second of all, you're right. They don't have to contend with this idea that social fabric completely breaks down. There's no society linked to it. What they do have to contend with, though, is that there is some degradation of the societal fabric and how that goes on to like impact communities, specifically like minority communities. You heard this a little bit about about breaking down of the patriarchy, we think like this gets hurt if you remove certain communitarian aspects or impetuses by embracing more individual culture. Now, for kind of like a breakdown of what we see, like the context surrounding this and what we think the burdens are. So we think like support means generally think this is a good idea for people in society writ large. We think like the burden on either team or either side is to show that it works both at the individual level, but also like maintains good continuity of society and that things like generally progress within society. We think Gov specifically needs to defend that the general society norm being supported this given like the greater holistic context of like the economic system that we live in, i.e. capitalism, right? So we think specifically that this culture can be easily abused given that we're already heading down an isolationist path in a lot of like aspects and impetuses, right? So we think we're already in an increasingly digitized world that everything can be done remotely. We think the general societal norm has been shifting towards away from community support and towards relative isolationism, i.e. millennials on average tend to have way fewer close friends than their parents' generation. We think problems that arise within this are like loneliness, which we think is a legitimate factor given like its high connection to mental illness and like materialism and drug and alcohol abuse, but also just like we think the lack of some communal support in real life pushes people to find support online in a community. And we don't think that's necessarily bad in the sense that like it's not bad to have online friends. However, we think it is a stopgap at the point at which there is no physical presence of like a community, be it family, kids or friends. We think this is like a harm that Gov will have to contend with. And I'm going to like explicate out why this creates like a really bad world in general. I think the last thing is that COVID has shown us that we don't even need to work in person and that there's a high likelihood that this will continue in the status quo to some degree. I think what this sets up for all of Op Bench is really showing how like this communal or like not embracing an isolationist societal norm is very important in pushing back against the worst abuses that can arise out of an individualistic society. Now, what do I mean? Like, what do I mean by the abuses of an individualistic society? I really have 4 big points on this, right? So I think the first thing is a rise in mental illness, right? Again, loneliness, depression, these are big things, and they have been linked with the fact that like with being out of touch with other human beings, at least in real life. We think this is a serious harm that Gov needs to kind of. Second of all, we think you see a rise in materialism. We think because there is not so much of a social outlet, people tend to go towards like very materialistic ideas to both fulfill their like minds and their pleasures, but also just to like generally like make sure their lives are good in absence of any other form of societal contact. Thirdly, we think individuals don't feel the need to reinvest back into the community. And we think this is especially important in poverty-stricken and more disenfranchised groups. Okay, we think individuals and communities are already heavily penalized by the existing legal and governmental structures within the United States, and specifically pushing this narrative does 2 bad things. First, those who are like penalized generally who are growing up don't have like strong community structures, but also specifically individuals that may make it out of those communities have less of a specific impetus to reinvest and break that cycle of poverty, because so far in the United States we have shown an utter inability to do this at any larger like governmental level. At the point at which government has failed you, panel, we need some sort of communitarian aspect to fill in those gaps and to end these or to at least counterbalance longstanding systemic and gender-based biases. Second, like continuing on this point, we think individuals specifically are less invested in trying to go back and fix the fundamental underlying problems of society, because if you yourself make it in Gov world, you are less tied to a community, and thus you have less impetus to like extend onto the future generations any like goodness or wealth that you have brought upon yourself. And we think this beats OOG's idea of solving for the patriarchy. We actually think people are less invested in general social causes because they are less, because the people who would be most willing to be or most able to make serious societal and structural change, those at the top are least likely to reinvest back into communities. If you have a more individualist lifestyle, I'll take CO. Oh, sorry, no, that's not, okay, I'm opposition, sorry. Finally, we find it philosophically problematic, okay? We think it puts all emphasis and success and failure on the individual, okay? I think, again, this is like a very unfair thing to put on groups that are already starting about 20 yards back from the starting line from everybody else. But we also think generally it's just a philosophically bad principle to assume that like, or to push on this idea that individual ability is like the one thing. Again, this kind of goes back into my rebuttal to OG, in which that like people overwork themselves because they're so obsessed with the idea that they themselves need to make it and they themselves need to have the economic progress necessitized that they have to go to these extreme lengths. Now, how do we get all these harms worsened in the Gov world, right? Okay, so we think, and this is going to be extended on big in my DLO's speech, but we think you cannot have a cultural norm of isolationism if you're already living in like an aspect of culture and society that has like a lot of isolationist tendencies, i.e. we already have kind of isolationist bents in a lot of ways. If we full on embrace it, you put all of these problems on methamphetamine. And we think this is a really bad thing for all the problems that I've already laid out. But why does it do this, right? We think the way of life is already isolationist, i.e. like even work can now be like digitized and brought away from like large scale group interactions. And we think you need society, like societal norms as a counterbalance. If the society generally finds this to be okay, society by proxy becomes more extreme because of a lot of other mechanisms, i.e. like capitalist incentives to push people away from each other, okay? So how does this act as a counterbalance? Well, like DLO is going to really extend this, but we think you come in like 3 different ways. We think community leaders, families, and community organizations, right? We think, to start with the community leaders point, that they are the ones who can check in on and like go to their flock, if you were to use a religious idea, and go out and make sure that like people are not becoming too isolationist and accruing basic harms that like I've already enumerated.
All right, thank you very much. Now invite the Deputy Prime Minister to close off the opening government side of this debate. Hear, hear.
Am I audible? Perfect. 3, 2, 1. I want to start off by addressing some of the refutations laid against the opening government case and some of the assertions that OO makes in their opening speech. They talk about how people are overworked in the United States and about how individualistic mindsets creates unnecessary stress. They lead a bunch of examples about how work is being digitized today, social media pushes people back. They're only taking the framework of an individualistic, capitalistic American society in the most developed world possible. They do not even, embrace the idea that these cultures can shift towards individualism, and cultures that are already deeply collectivist can be beneficial in some form of way. That a dosage of individualism can help create a shift towards a more holistic norm. They only take extremes and pretend that that's how the entire world operates in this incredibly Western mindset, which makes their arguments very unconvincing in the long run, especially in comparison to what Andrew lays out about Japanese culture, etc., who benefit from that sort of shift towards individualism. They say that the burden is on either team to show how this sort of works on the individual level and a societal level. But our argument is that the individual is most directly affected by social norms and institutions. So the team in today's debate, which can build the most credible social norms and institutions, are the ones that are benefiting the most individuals. And that should be the most credible impact of today's debate, the building of credible institutions that help people in the long run. So more specifically, they talk about how technology has encouraged isolationism and millennials have fewer friends today. I would argue that a need for collectivism and a need to be part of a social group as a whole and to be dependent on value derived by others is a cause for that same sort of anxiety that my opponents are to talk about in today's debate. They conflate technological advancement with something that's inherent towards individualism. When technological advancement can have a cause that is collectivist for the anxiety that occurs today. Again, they just conflate these things like individualism, capitalism, and problems in today's debate. They do not make delineations, and that is what is important in today's debate. Then they say that we can push back against forms of abuse. The main warrant here that ties together what they say is that we don't feel a need to contribute back to society if we're individualistic, because rather we can push a narrative that we can penalize others. 2 main responses. The first is that self-interest is something that's inherent to everyone. If you only thought about yourself and constantly hurt others, it would hurt you in the long run. So that is part of your internal self-interest, and that's something that you incorporate into your thought. It's why empathy exists within humans. If you buy their depiction of the people as sort of Hobbesian in nature, you would lead to conclusions like you need a sort of Leviathan to sort of take control over society. They forget the fact that empathy is something that is also inherent, and that self-interest is also preserving the integrity of others. So just because you start to feel individualistic doesn't mean you suddenly start hurting others. It means you start to also prioritize yourself within a society that makes you feel anxious constantly through things like the rise of technology. The second thing is that they assume that harming others, what they've missed the mark on is that harming others can be considered not in your own self-interest, because helping others and also helping yourself aren't mutually exclusive. Again, something they completely missed the mark on. They also never developed the mechanism as to why family is actually good, because they just run out of time in their last speech. So real quickly, I'm going to develop an off-case argument that will link into the strongest weighing in this round of building a credible institution. What we would argue is that independence-oriented cultures have been the linchpin of economic development globally in the last couple of decades, and will be the linchpin for the future economic development of the global poor, which are going to be the most important impact, because they're the people who direly need these social institutions the most for a couple of main reasons. 3 specifically. The first is that time spent to ruminate on your own self-worth helps you assign value towards your own skills. Rather than think of terms of how the state can generate value or how a collectivist society can give value to each individual person, you internalize yourself as a stronger actor of agency. Once you develop this framework, you're likely to generate political will for global markets because they value the relative skills that dominate particular countries and particular societies, and your relative agency is more maximized inside a market setting. The second main reason is that a faith in communal organizations often leads to protectionism and anti-market behavior. This is because skills being outsourced towards other countries or districts or areas are seen as taking away from the responsibilities of the current existing community, which devalues a person or a group's legitimacy. As a result, these types of countries or cultures become increasingly disillusioned with global markets because they see it as a form of slipping away their own power and their hegemony that they've developed inside the long run, which is why there's a trade-off between embracing this mindset and embracing a global market, which we've seen in countless countries that, if you take the difference between the East Asian Pacific and Sub-Saharan Africa, which I'll expand more on later. The third main reason is that the innovation that is conducive towards global economic development is muted by communal culture and bolstered by individualistic mindsets. How so? Communal settings prioritize access over the creation of new products. This is because self-interest is looked down upon, and there is a higher threshold for ideas that don't impact all the people in the community, and those are shut out more commonly. On the corollary, individualistic cultures are encouraged to propose new products, new ideas, etc., that affect any number or group of people, even if not universally applicable. And as a result, they end up creating innovative methods of distribution and production that almost universally end up outpacing those found in collectivist society and create broader methods of access and achieve their goals even better. With these three sort of mechanisms in mind of why there is a trade-off between global markets and collectivism, and there is a bolstering between independence and global markets, we can look to specific examples of how this has actually been implemented. For example, the East Asian Pacific holds a strong collectivist culture that Andrew thoroughly outlines in the opening speech about how Japan does this. But with the embracement of individualistic changes, as a result, it has been more incorporated into global markets, and subsequently, we've seen the largest poverty reduction in human history in the East Asian Pacific. Integration into global markets is really important because, one, it ensures that there are less reasons for both domestic and international conflict, as now you become more reliant on others for your own success and own outcome, which is why there has not been a major war in the past couple of decades because of the rapid globalization and increase of global market access. The second big reason is that it gives you access to resources that domestically you cannot produce efficiently, increasing the efficacy of our local institutions, and giving us more political space to start legislating on things like welfare and social institutions and things that help people poor. It gives governments the capacity to start doing other things, which opens up more institutions. The third big reason is that it opens countries up to international institutions that give things like foreign direct investment or foreign aid, that then brings new technologies and procedures that spill over domestically onto other people, which gives you, again, more tax bases, more ability for the government to start doing good things, and the ability to start creating institutions in the places where the global poor exists, so they can finally have some sense of the human condition that is comparative towards the developed world that my opponents spend the entire time talking about. The embrace of markets is why, even in China, a collectivist authoritarian society, the embrace of markets post-80s lifted hundreds of millions of people in the fastest poverty reduction that humankind has ever seen. It's how collectivist society like South Korea transitioned into a top 10 economy of the world while still having strong social values. The status quo has many sub-Saharan African countries resist markets because of a cultural collectivist will. And this is not something that we want to eradicate. We want to maintain their culture, but we also want a shift towards individualism so that they can be integrated into global markets. Because again, that is the linchpin for developing any institution in the long run. How do you get a tax base? How do you make it so that poor people aren't just poor for the next 100 years? It's by embracing global markets. It's by bringing them in, making them less likely towards points of conflict, and by creating that sort of system. This is by and far the most valuable impact in the round. Even if we concede all the social harms, this is the only way forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I now invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to close off the top half of this debate. Hear, hear.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. Okay, before I start my case, I would just like to thank people who are hosting this tournament and the chairs who are chairing this round. I know it's been a long time. Let's finish this. Okay, so my speech will start in 3, 2, 1. I will do 3 things in this speech. First, I will do some rebuilding for our case by making rebuttal commentary on the Gov's bench. Second, I will present extension to my partner's case. And third, I will say overall why we win this debate. First, I would just like to say it's kind of ironic that OG picks very entirely collectivist culture's rise to success, especially in the global economic world, to illustrate to us why a push towards isolationism is good. Honestly, as a Chinese, I'm kind of confused. Secondly, we also want to illustrate why Gov failed to prove their own burden. To the panel, right? We believe Gov's burden in this debate is to identify to us what support means. And what support means is generally thinking that something is a good idea for people and the society at large. And what Gov needed to do was to defend this general societal norm of being supportive of this push towards isolationism. Okay, so, right. Let's go into my speech. So commentary on Gov's case. The first problem of OG's case is their cherry-picked example and their lack of broader commentary on society. They tell you a lot of problems that arise from toxic communal culture without contending with what happens to the benefits that communal culture brings. This makes this debate hard because we as opposition don't want to defend employers who work their employees to death or bullies, but that is not our burden either. A simple answer to what happens when you're bullied is to find a support network that allows you to stand up to them and heal you along the process. And bullies, usually someone who yearns for understanding and communal support as well, should also do this so they stop bullying people. We think bad communities need to be fixed, but the solution isn't to get rid of communities or support a complete individualistic culture or push towards isolationism. Then their case also doesn't provide enough mechanism to tell us how the general societal fabric would be better. They don't correctly identify the problems society faces now. Therefore, the cultural norm they support also was not properly mechanized out to explain why they solve for societal problems. They cherry-pick examples of Japanese collectivism and the harms on that. But they don't tell you what the broader societal problems that are facing not only Japan, but also the most of the developed world either. Notice that Ops' burden in this case is not to support collectivism, but to tell you why the push towards isolationism is the antithesis to what our society needs right now, and why our hyper individualistic society, like single household, different view on romance, and this idea of isolationism is bad. We're not trying to argue that some individualistic tendency in collectivist culture is bad. We're trying to talk about the motion, which literally gives you a push towards isolationism. Now, present extension to my partner's case. My partner first set up a characterization for our society today, which we did not hear a rebuttal. So we're going to think that Gov agree with us on that characterization. What is that characterization? The characterization is we live in an increasingly digitized age. The general societal realities is already setting people up in a world where communal support is easily ignored and people are placed in highly isolated working and societal environment. Look no further than COVID. We realize that we don't need to go to work to do work. We don't need to meet in person to debate. This means that we are already on the brink of an isolationist society. So how does OO win this debate? So I'm going to do two clarifying questions, right? First, if we can illustrate to you why isolationist society is bad, and why an isolationist society will be achieved in Gov's world. So for why isolationist society is bad. Pragmatically speaking, society occurs an increasing amount of loneliness. This is the impact of this. First, rise in mental illness that is associated with isolationism. You simply have no one to turn to. Since OG loves to use Japan as an example, I will also give you an example of Japan. There are literally young men in Japan who are so disillusioned with society, instead of trying to fix societal problems or engage in communal activities, they decide to never leave their apartment. They live on Amazon Prime and delivery. Many of them unfortunately take their own life and then being found weeks after their death because they don't contact anyone. The lack of communal support in real life pushes them to be an isolationist and unable to find a support system when they need it the most. Society, because becoming so familiar with this type of culture, also also fails to extend the proper help to these people. Second, there's a rising materialism in an isolationist culture where you find mental solace in that materialism and the philosophical point my partner brings you, where people stake their own success only on themselves. So when they themselves fail, they are plunged into depression rather than find pride in their community and the success of others. Thirdly, there's a failure to give back to society, which engages with their empowering woman point. We don't believe feminists in their world get the best solvency when they will only focus on their individualist success or their individualistic escape from patriarchy, rather than give back to the society and try to fix the societal norm that oppresses every woman. So they also fail on their own solvency. Because before I go into why does isolationist society only happens in their world, I'll take OG. OG?
Okay, so you give the example of Japan. So if Japan is more of a collectivist society and there are these outcasts, wouldn't that be a result of social pressures that make them feel guilty and locked in because they don't feel like they can actually be themselves?
I'm sorry, it's time. I think I got your point. Yes, we do believe the collectivist culture has some toxicity in it, but we believe the better way is to form better communal structure and communally fix the societal problem. Individually, you cannot change anything. And when you escape, you fall into the other trap of depression, mental illness, and lack of communal support. Realize that toxic communities does not define every community. So why does isolationist society only happen in their world? In our world, we're not arguing for collectivism. We still believe people can have agency, especially if their agency benefits society and change it better for everyone, including themselves, and they can take pride in that. Whereas in their world, because the cultural norm does not counteract the social reality of being on the brink of an isolationist society, result in a lack of societal mechanism to fix the slowly isolationist society and the harms that people incur. Communal leaders will no longer want to exist or feel the need to establish communal help to people who need it. People slowly become disillusioned with the societal lack of support and retreat into a position of complete loneliness. And people stake their own success on themselves, and when they fail, finding no pride or no mechanism to fix their own failure outside of themselves. Therefore, we take this debate on solvency and on establishing a better society. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We now invite the member of government to open up the back half of this debate. Here.
All right, can everyone hear me all right? Cool. And I have like really bad eyes. So if you have a point, please like raise your hand closer to the screen because I can't read the chat for my life. Cool. Starting now. So there's a few things that I really need to get through in this debate, so it's going to jump right into the argumentation. First is refutation of some of the greater assumptions and general themes on the top half. So first, opening government makes a very unstrategic concession when they open by saying that there's a fundamental trade-off that exists both ways between the focus on the individual and the collective. We, on a side closing government, are going to distance ourselves from that assumption, right? While we think it's a really important clash between individualism and collectivism, it's much more nuanced than you have one or the other, right? We posit to you that when we are so entrenched in the collective, we tend individuals tend to actively work towards things like conforming to what like society wants you to be based on social pressures, which innately erase the individual. But we did not receive the comparative analysis on why there was a real warrant from the top half of opening opposition on why a focus on the individual fundamentally and innately erases the community. The trade-off has not been warranted on either side. We're going to win that debate. But further on the opening oppositions, some of their problems with the general themes, right? Their weighing mechanism that they posit to you in their very first speech was like, prioritize the collective, because like that's what's most important. And I was just sitting there, like this is a debate about collectivism versus individualism, and you're telling us to just like buy the collective and put that first without actually explaining why the collective is more important to the impacts that happen to the individual, which is another way we are going to separate ourselves from the top half of this debate, moving down some of the more specific kind of conclusions that they receive, that rather opening opposition tries to get to. They tell you that isolationism is uniquely bad. Cool. There are two impacts for this, where like people are less likely to invest in the community. Okay. And second is that it like worsens the mental health impacts towards the individual. So first, we're going to contend that the premise is simply not true, right? They are assuming that somehow 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 isolation is synonymous with a focus on the individual, right? Without explaining why that trade-off exists. We're going to provide more of that in our positive matter. I promise I'll flag it. But so more on the reinvesting in the common good. First, this was just like totally not warranted. It was actually kind of like in nature exploitative, because they're focusing on how like people in the global south and in the developing world just like need collectivism for some reason, because people will leave and then not like return. You can't just like provide like that much warranting and expect that to like land at the end of the day. We recognize that poverty exists in both worlds, in both societies, both in a collectivist and an individual world. But we recognize that actually some kind of focus on the individual and independence, being able to leave your village or your society, right, which is entrenched in poverty, intergenerational poverty, going back and even like coming back provides at least some chance that we can begin to solve or mitigate for some of these impacts that they bring up. And finally, the mental health issue, which is not nuanced at all. Like there's still like a very significant and substantial stigma surrounding things like independent time or like focusing on yourself, right? Self-care is really, really important. And we think that self-care is actually a really intrinsic part of the way that individuals see themselves as like unique and sort of like on our side of the house. But the points that's really going to separate us and give us our unique offense that is going to separate closing government from opening government and opening opposition, and probably closing opposition as well, is because we are going to engage in the direct clash that lies between collectivism and the individual on a nuanced way that allows us to actually have the best of both worlds, right? At its core, this emotion that asks us to debate the two ways that people engage with each other and their communities, right? So first, we think that like East Asian societies tend to rely on the value of collectivism. Cool. And Western societies tend to value on the individual rather, right? And so we think that while Western societies value the individual, there is still significant focus on things like collectivism, which I will also flag later. Please remember that. But so we're going to use a sociological lens that first examines the way that individuals interact with themselves and also the way that individuals interact with other people and the collective as a whole, right? So that's where our offense is going to come from. First, let's focus on how the comparative exists between the way individuals interact with themselves. We recognize that when people can begin to free themselves from this kind of like sense of conformity that is so present in the collectivist cultures that we hear such a spirited defense of on side opening opposition, we can actually begin to see a sense of self-development rather. And we sort of saw like the deputy prime minister kind of mentioned this for about 15 seconds we counted. We recognize that there is innate value to having this kind of knowing who you are independent of the people around you, right? And so if your mother tells you that you are something, if your father tells you that you hold certain values or talents or traits, or you belong to a certain body that just gives you innately like certain kinds of like value, we recognize that that kind of value is not coming from what is inside, rather that's external value. And that's not really satisfying the kind of value that we think we ought to hear, but rather we think that celebrating and acknowledging our differences that are actually like innate in any world, whether you are a member of a collectivist society or individual society, there are going to be differences. Acknowledging and celebrating those differences are absolutely key in developing a sense of self. And that kind of also kind of has this intuitive transfer into some of the impacts that we are seeing. It's 5:15. Does anyone have a point?
Yeah, OO here. Realize that GovBench will have to explain to us why you must become a single household, or if you must move away from communal activities to know who you are. Understand that the moving away from community is isolationism rather than individualism. Please prove your point why you're arguing for individualism rather than isolationism.
Right, so individualism is unique from isolationism. First, I told you why a focus on the collective innately and fundamentally erases the individual. There's that trade-off. But then you also haven't warranted on why it is the case, right? And I'll talk about in the second point. But we also recognize that building off of a sense of self is this kind of agency that people have once they begin to really experience the way that like who they truly are, and then understand the kind of power that they can have, where they can move away from like something that might be like a toxic environment. For example, like family rejection, which brings us into the second kind of argument that we're talking about, which analyzes the way that individuals interact with each other on a comparative level, right? So we recognize that, for example, in the West, even though it's an individual society, there are collectivist things like family values and an obligation to that family, right? Sometimes like moving away from your family, for example, like queer people who are rejected from their homes can find new kinds of communities that is based on this idea that you were independent before you found the community that met the most to you, which means that we can actually strengthen communities and the kind of different diversity and exposure that we get to these communities That's innately valuable given opening governments and opening opposition's own mechanisms for weighing. And second, we also tell you that we can strengthen the individual, which empowers them to give back to society, right? So for example, in the developing world, someone who like has to make the decision between going to get an education somewhere far away or like remaining in the same kind of labor as like the family has, which is like a pretty accepted theme at this point in the debate, we recognize that the possibility to go and get an education, move away, build your own income actually gives you at least some chance of enabling you to reinvest in society in a way that is not possible if we have the same kind of rigid kind of collectivism that side opposition defends. So proud to propose.
Thank you very much. Now invite the member of opposition to open up the back half op of this debate. Here.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Good. All right, and I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. All right, great. So, to start off, I think that one of the most important things in this debate is the clash in it, right? This whole thing of communalism versus individualism. While our top half says that we do not have the burden of protecting collectivism and like defending that idea and why we should focus on it, we're actually going to distance ourselves from them a little bit and actually focus on collectivism for our arguments, right? As our like distinct extension from them in this debate. So to do that, I'm going to be giving you 3 points of positive material, right? The first titled, "It Takes a Village," the second about individualism under capitalism, and the third is titled "Interdependent Isolationist," right? And there will be interwoven rebuttal throughout. Okay, so now to start off with, the first thing that we're going to be talking about is how it takes a village, right? And that's not only talking about like raising children or things along those lines. That's talking about like being human and like interacting with people in general, okay? And so we like need to bring to you the fact that humans are social creatures, right? We need to interact with people. We have to like, you know, have some form of relationships with people around us. Like, it's important to point out that like, if you look at things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the third rung on it, which is like right under like self-confidence and like self-actualization, right? The third rung is like social bonds and companionship, i.e. like your community, the people around you. This is something that's like extremely important, and like it's actually hard to even like come close to self-actualizing without that, which is interesting because like their whole argument is based on like reaching self-actualization without those things, which will tie into our point on individualism under capitalism, but I'll come back to that later. Furthermore, we also like to point out to you that like isolation, i.e. things like solitary confinement and things along those lines, is quite literally seen as a punishment in the status quo, right? Meaning that we like understand that isolation and like keeping people from interacting with others is a punishment. It will like harm people's mental health. It will like hurt people, right? And finally, on this point about it taking a village to do anything, let's talk about like the effects that this will have on people in general, right? This removes any like financial support network you had, right? By separating you from family, by separating you from like community and friends. This removes like things like, you know, mental health help, seeing as you no longer have like people to talk to, since you're focused on your individual success, since you're focused on your life as an individual, right? And then finally, this removes like assistance in living in general, right? You won't have like people around you to help you with things in your daily life and things along those lines, right? The whole culture that they're pushing for is one where you focus on yourself and focus on the individual, which goes directly into our point on individualism under capitalism, okay? So we think it's like very important to point out that lots of this overworking and lots of this like point on conformity that they're talking about actually can stem from the capitalist system forcing people to go for self-actualization instead of these social bonds that we're saying they need to survive, right? And what exactly do we mean by this? We mean that this individualist world is like having people prioritize their own like success through these material means and success through money and things along those lines, right? And we believe that like it forces individuals to, we believe that like under capitalism, individuals are forced to, one, exploit those around them, and two, like build greedy mindsets and like selfish mindsets. We believe that like forcing an individualist culture will only exacerbate this more by telling people they only need to focus on themselves, their own needs, and their own self-actualization without focusing on bonds and the people around them in their community. We believe that, this culture of individuality will like inherently lead to people like building like hierarchical power structures based off the capital they have and exploiting like those around them, right? Forcing those who don't exactly fit into their like most efficient, most like, you know, profit-driven like modes of living out into outcasts, into like not being able to like be part of like whatever business or whatever like profit they're forming, and will just lead to like people being like ostracized, similar to like what they brought up before, and lead to people being like exploited if they aren't. Furthermore, let's get into this point about interdependent isolationism, right? So in the modern day, we understand that like most people cannot simply survive on their own, right? We rely on other people. We just don't have the skills to like go out and hoof it, right? We can't just like head out into the wild and like get everything for ourselves. And that's because like responsibilities, jobs, and labor has been stratified among the populace, and like we rely on other people for other things constantly. So this means that like interaction is required, right? And as we know, like social skills and things along those lines require practice, right? You have to practice to get better at communicating, to get better at like interacting with the people around you. So by taking away like this practice, by making people focus on like being individuals, being alone, and things along those lines, we're now like taking away ample time these people get to practice these social skills, and take away ample time these people have to like gain the skills they need to like negotiate for like resources someone else might have, or like, you know, ask someone to do certain things or certain favors for them. Meaning that now in this world they're trying to paint, where people are individuals, people are on their own, but can still get help from others, people are now less capable of getting help from others. People are now getting help from others overall. So fundamentally, we like reject this idea that like the government myth is bringing up, that like the impetus for self-actualization should be just the self, right? We believe that like selfishness and things along those lines will simply lead to you like harming others to like reach certain goals, but never actually getting any like emotional satisfaction, or never actually getting any like, you know, actualization from like relationships and things along those lines. With oh wait, actually I'll take OG before I'm out of time.
Hi, thank you. My question is, so does the individualist ideal mean the complete dissolution of all communities and isolationism, i.e. the US has a more individualist ideal, but probably still has communities?
Right. So I think it's important to point out that acknowledging the importance of the collective, and acknowledging that like the collective is needed, is inherently a collectivist ideal, right? I mean, you guys in OG are putting forth this argument that, oh yes, we want people to focus on themselves, but we also like want people's success to be based on other. And like we think that that inherently is just a contradiction, seeing as like your success being based on like the lives and success of others is just collectivist. That's just what that is. That falls on our side of the house. But let's talk about like some of the things that like they've brought up on their side, right? They like tried to like mitigate a lot of like OO's arguments by saying things like poverty exists in both worlds, and that there's no nuanced mental health argument. However, we'd like to point out that like, one, we've put a lot more links onto the mental health argument, and two, while poverty may exist in both worlds, we believe that OO brings a very solid critique in saying that people will not come back to their communities and will not help individuals who have not had the chance to make it out and to become, you know, less impoverished. For these reasons, we urge a opposition ballot.
Okay, thank you very much. I now invite the Gov Whip to close off the government half of this debate. Here.
Can everyone hear me? Sorry, echo. We good? Okay, if you have a POI, just like wave at me or piece of paper. I'm not going to be checking the chat. So let me go ahead and start my time now. A whole isn't a whole without its parts. That is to say that in this debate round, a community is not a community if the individuals that are supposed to be part of this community are only there because they're forced and because they're pressured by society to do so. So onto the top half debate. I would say that like this entire clash can be summarized to the idea of how should we deal with societal pressures, right? Both sides recognize that there's like a lot of societal pressures that exist in the status quo. And on the open and gov side, they like bring up this idea of like racial conformity and like bullying and how this is all bad. And the main response that we see from opening opposition is that like isolation is increasing in the status quo. And as it increases, we're seeing these societal pressures also increase. And that so like therefore by that same like chain of logic, that when we increase isolation, then that like these pressures are just going to get worse. However, like you're going to look to the opening government on this side, because as Hans provides like the unique layer of analysis where we tell you that an individual sense of self actually helps prevent this conforming from happening in this first place. But secondly, opening government tries to like respond to the like entire predication of opening opposition by trying to outweigh, by saying that like pressure by society is bad too, like not just individual. However, again, look to the fact that like on opening government, they don't provide any unique analysis on individualism versus collectivism, right? They set up this debate in such a way that we see that individualism and collectivism can't be on the same terms. They say it's black and white and you can't have both exist in the same world. But look to Han's analysis where we tell you that both of them inherently exist. So we're going to try to look at a world where both of them kind of interfere with one another, and you're going to be voting on what side has those best interferences. So moving on to the closing half of this debate. What we hear coming out from closing opposition is kind of this echo chamber of what we hear on the opening half, right? They say isolation is bad, but again, like they don't really have any warrants, right? They just kind of like echo the claims that happened in the first half of the debate, but they don't flesh them out anymore. They don't tell us specifically why isolation is bad or why it's going to continue to get worse in the status quo. Then again, they try to bring up also this idea, kind of like what opening government says too, or like opening opposition, about like how people can go in and like start to solve poverty when they have more of this community mindset, and how like in the long run, the opposition bench is going to be solving for like poverty and like all these other like egregious impacts, which again, they don't really warrant out to. But secondly, we would say that if you want to solve for any of this stuff, you're going to have to look to the opening government where we provide you like an actual link chain and an actual mechanism in which this happens. The entire opening half of this debate and closing opposition don't have any links. So look to the links that we provide to you in Hans' speech, which are going to be key. He tells you that in the status quo, it's inherent that individualism and collectivism are going to both happen at the same time. And that by having only collectivism, you erase a sense of individuality. And this goes completely unengaged with throughout closing opposition. So completely extend this through. And we would say that there's a trade-off between this, right? We would say that collectivism excludes independence, but independence does not necessarily exclude collectivism. This is a one-way trade-off that completely goes unaddressed. But before I move on, I'll go ahead and answer a POI from
OO argues that we must present a cultural mechanism to counteract an already increasingly isolationist society. It is not the dichotomy of collectivism versus individualism. It is providing solvency and mechanism to the most vulnerable actor so the society can extend help and become better rather than promoting individual escape from harsh realities.
Okay, I'm really glad that you brought that up because that's going to be like the main voter on OG. So I'll flag that when I get to a response. But going off of what Hans says again, that goes pretty much unaddressed in the closing opposition speech. He tells you that when individuals have the opportunity to interact with themselves, when they're kind of taken out of like this sense that like they don't have identity, when they're able to kind of sit down and see what happens, that means that they're free from conformity, which means that like they kind of sit down and start to figure out things on their own. But we tell you that when this happens, we have a sense of self increase inherently. And we tell you that as this happens and as individuals have time to reflect, they're able to see the differences that occur between like what their individual goals are and maybe what like the other compounding like social factors or societal factors are, maybe like work, family, like societal, or just like in general. And we tell you that like when they're able to sit down and like reflect on these things, then they like are automatically like in this situation where they're empowered to, if they want to, maybe like change the course of where they're going, or kind of figure out how to make their like individual goals like better happen. And we tell you that when that happens, like, and if an individual like decides to kind of uproot themselves from the path in which they're like going on already, then they can start to expose themselves to more things, right? They're not forced into these like norms and like into conformity. When they take a step back and figure out what their goals are, they can kind of start to do this on their own. And we tell you this is really important, and this is going to be the main voter in the round because this leads to more interaction with one another. We tell you that like as an individual is able to step out and go to like kind of experience other worlds, we see that they get more exposure to other communities and that are like developed with their independence, right? Hans gives you the example of the LGBTQ community, where we tell you that like individuals from certain communities all around the US were able to fraction themselves from the communities that they're already in to create new communities. In our world, we're only gaining more communities. We're not completely destroying other communities that already exist. And the opposition does a terrible job of explaining this warranting, so flow ours through. But secondly, we would say that this is really important when people start to gain exposure to things that are outside of their comfort zone or outside of their own communities that they interact with. We tell you that when they do this, they can kind of like start to, again, work towards their own goals, which means maybe they can have more economic power, right? Maybe they get better jobs and they can come back to those same communities and help fund some of those like gains back into the communities in the first place. We would also tell you that this is also like very socially important because as people go out and start to get exposed to more things also, that can kind of start to like have a conversation begin, right? We tell you that like when they go out and see different things happening in the world, they can bring their new worldview back into their own community and start to maybe have an impetus for change and engage in difficult conversations. And again, like this goes completely unaddressed by all closing opposition. Extend our analysis through, because one, it's the only analysis that's provided throughout the round. And secondly, it goes like completely unaddressed. We would say, sure, community is important. We concede that. But we tell you that if you want to actually achieve a better community, you do that through our world. And we tell you do that by allowing the individual to focus on themselves first, so that they can go through and make their communities better in the long run. And there's no more time, so no more POIs. But we would tell you too that the impacts of the individual, this is where you're going to be weighing the round. We tell you that when you look at this on an individualistic level, this is really important for mental health and self help and just like mental health and like getting better on the individual level. But we tell you that like the second layer of analysis that's added is the community, right? A whole isn't a whole without its parts. And if you don't have someone that's like feeling it part of the community, then they have to address like their individual. So proud to open.
Thank you very much for your speech, and invite the opposition whip to close off the opposition side and indeed the debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
Can everybody hear me? Awesome sauce. Before I start quickly, I prefer POIs in the chat. If it doesn't seem like I've seen it, just do a little wave. Preferably don't interrupt me because I can get derailed very easily when it comes to my speaking. So on that, I'll just hop right into our case in 3, 2, 1. All right, so first things first, I'd like to thank everyone for a wonderful round. This was definitely a round, in my opinion, that was worthy of the finals, and I enjoyed being able to participate with everyone here today. Now, getting into the nitty gritty of it, because this is a competition, right? We are fundamentally rejecting this house supporting the embrace of independence-oriented cultures, right? My partner brings to you several reasons why this is the case. And of course, we had some good clash in today's round, but I'm going to show you why ultimately you cannot cast a ballot in favor of any other group than the opposition bench, right? And that's because the clash for today really, honestly, if you listen to the arguments that are presented by the government bench as opposed to the opposition bench, has not really been a clash of prioritizing the individual versus the collective. Rather, what we've seen in today's round is an acknowledgement universally of the importance of the collective and a debate about the best way to strengthen the collective. Whether we get this idea that's really fleshed out and brought by the closing government, whether it is important for, the whole to be strengthened by having stronger individual parts, or necessarily this idea that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Whereas the opposition bench has brought to you the idea that fundamentally it is the purpose of a collective to help individuals self-actualize, get to that necessary state of strength, and that is why prioritizing that is fundamental to actually creating a better society. I saw a point from opening. Yeah, I'll take that from opening really quickly.
Okay, so the collectivist ideal is the idea of prioritizing the group over the individual, which is not the same as saying that community is opposed to individualism. Please engage.
Sure. To engage with that point, actually, in my engagement with that, I'll actually bring up specifically something that the closing government said. There's this idea that we did not acknowledge that there's kind of the idea, or I guess the picture's been painted as that there's kind of this imbalance counterfactual, like the prioritization of the collective erases the self, but the prioritization of the self does not directly erase the collective. We simply say this is fundamentally incorrect for one point that is brought to you by my partner, right? And this is because we fundamentally are rejecting the idea that you need to prioritize the self over the collective. My partner tells you the idea, or brings you the idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and brings you that fundamentally, psychologically, it is acknowledged that traditionally speaking, social bonds and community are more important psychologically than self-actualization. And insofar as the government bench has largely prioritized self-actualizing before joining groups, we're telling you that this incongruity is actually what's causing the mental health issues. We're telling you that's what's causing the issues and the lack of self-fulfillment in the status quo, because you see people who are part of these collective societies where the idea of the society is promoted above the self, but really what this is feeding into, thanks to capitalism and thanks to traditional societal norms, is the idea that one has to self-actualize and be competent in the context of the group before you find yourself. I'll take that point from closing, actually.
Right, so you still haven't engaged with the heart of what we are saying. We are saying that not one is more important than the other, but we're saying that you can have both, because when you have a strong individual, they have the ability to give back to the group. Whereas if you have a really strong group, the social pressures make the individual impossible to stand out.
I do believe we have clashed with that actually, simply for the fact that again we're engaging with the idea that prioritizing actualizing the self, coming into the fullest extent of yourself before you join the collective to have the strongest possible collective is fundamentally not collective. It goes against our side of the bench, and also is fundamentally harmful. Therefore, pursuing that action congruent with your side of the house and incongruent with our side of the house, we've demonstrated to you is a harmful action for the reasons I was just illustrating, because of the need to prioritize a collective that prioritizes itself, because they've characterized all collectives as one that fundamentally, propagates the idea that you need to sacrifice yourself for the collective, like the collective is the greater good. And this is not actually inherent to collectivism. We bring to the idea that collectivism comes in multiple forms, and they have identified it and cherry picked one that can potentially be seen as, somewhat harmful. But this is not fundamental to collectivism. Collectivism is simply an acknowledgement of the idea that one cannot survive without the whole. There is no self without the whole, as the counterfactual of this idea is that there's no whole without the self. We believe that's clash in today's round. We believe that's the grounds you guys have, and we believe we've engaged with that because we bring to the idea that fundamentally the individual is going to be weakened by prioritizing the individual over the self. Again, thanks to Maslow's hierarchy, thanks to other factors that we've identified in today's round. Also, we would like to contest with the idea that they bring to you again, that finding your strongest identity is going to strengthen the collective overall. We see a lot of arguments that strengthening the collective coming from the government bench, which is confusing because if we are prioritizing strengthening the collective, we are prioritizing a society which values collectivism more than individualism. And so I don't really know how that weighs out on their side of the house. But furthermore, we bring to you the idea that they bring to you a lot of analysis about groups being able to necessarily distance themselves from their biological family, found family, people who may be queer, and such as myself, that need to step away from their family that may be necessarily more oppressive and harmful factors to them. We recognize the importance of that, but again, we say to you, insofar as we're prioritizing the ability of an individual to find their identity, to find their groups that they identify with, they are just seeking a new collective, not seeking to abolish the idea of an importance of a collective in their lives. And so, insofar as we're still recognizing the importance of collectives on either side of the house, I don't really know how you can cast a ballot in favor of the government bench. But in summation, I'm going to bring this back and just kind of wrap up the positive material brought to you by my partner and hopefully make everything nice and tidy. I'm sorry I won't be taking any more points in this speech. So my partner brings to you several points, right? First, it takes a village. The idea that innately humans are fundamentally social creatures that do not operate in vacuums. Now, I want to make this clear, right? We're not claiming that the government bench or the government position has to defend a world where everyone lives in, hyperbaric chambers and they're in isolation. They never interact with other individuals. That's not how we're contextualizing their grounds. However, we're saying they only access the benefits of collectivism that they're strengthening when you have a society that prioritizes collectivism. That is fundamentally the whole point of the debate, having some kind of necessary difference. They can't claim that they gain all the access to the importance of a collectivism in a society that does not prioritize that same collectivism, when prioritization of that collectivism is fundamental to understanding and operating as a society that is going to be healthy. So now that we know that's not what we're saying about the grounds, what are we saying? We're saying something very simple to you. The closing opposition benches bring you to the idea that trying to self-actualize before you meet your needs for collective, before you strengthen your collective bonds and the support that you need from other individuals, you are fundamentally not going to be self-actualized. This is strengthened by the individual. This is strengthened by the case of the individuals they bring to you from Japan. And a lot of their examples, actually, they bring to you a lot of these ideas of individuals not finding their fulfillment in the collective. And we're telling you this is stemming directly from the fact that people are prioritizing self-actualization, a higher level need in terms of pyramid, over a more base level need. And so for that simple reason, we are urging you cast your ballot in favor of the opposition bench. And thank you all for participating today.